Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, as we approach patch 1.4.1, just under 2 weeks after the launch of Season 4, and as the player base moves further and further into the endgame, one part of the new item system will become more and more impactful, which is Greater Affixes. These can range from making an item a little bit better to making it ridiculous, and these can happen on even up to every single affix an item has, and this goes up to even uniques and uber unique items as well, as crazy as that sounds to imagine. The top tier versions of every build that you would want to play can only be improved by having these, and some of them far more than others, as they are sort of the final frontier of gear improvements. Masterworking is the final upgrade system that you unlock, but it is manually controllable. It is something that you can actively farm in an activity that the game dictates, whereas Greater Affixes rely entirely on RNG. Well, I mean, you could argue the same about uber unique items, but that doesn't mean there aren't better ways to go about farming them with higher drop rates than others. On top of that, the second consideration of Greater Affix items is tempering, because through tempering you can brick an item, and if you find an item with particularly impressive multiple Greater Affixes, that's the last thing that you want to do. So we'll just go over how to best avoid bricking an item while still making the item into what you want it to be. Starting off then with ways to farm Greater Affixes, good places to get them relatively easily. There are two specific activities that both I and other players have noticed much higher drop rates of Greater Affix equipment within. The first is the Blood Maiden altar events in World Tier 4 in the Helltide, specifically with the Profane Mind Cage item active to raise the level of the enemies. This is the only place I have found items with 3 Greater Affixes on them, and the place where the majority of my double Greater Affixes have come from as well. A really nice double up from this is that you will get a ton of Infernal Cinders while doing this activity with the buff up, which results in opening more Helltide chests, and Helltide chests all give Murmuring Obols this season, which you can trade in any major town for any equipment slot of your choosing, and these do have a chance of dropping Greater Affix gear, not an overly high one, but just a nice doubling up anyways that I felt was necessary to mention. It's also worth mentioning at the same time that higher pit tiers actually reward a weirdly large amount of Obols as well, so you can sort of scattershot aim for a specific slot by doing high tier pit runs, which will also give you masterworking materials, so again just a really nice double up activity. The other main thing that seems to have higher drop rates of Greater Affix items is Torment endgame ladder bosses, especially Duriel and Endariel, but that shouldn't really come as a surprise. Basically what it seems like is going on here is the best sources of Greater Affix gear are enemies that are over level 100, but specifically in situations that drop massive amounts of gear. Of course, Nightmare dungeons obviously go above level 100, but they don't drop anywhere close to as much gear as a Blood Maiden event that only takes like a minute, or as a Torment ladder boss does either. Same goes for the pit. Obviously higher level enemies are in there and there's a small bit of gear at the end of it, but the relative gear to time ratio is just far worse than specifically Blood Maiden and Torment bosses. Altogether, the paths here are sort of simple. If you want to actively farm Greater Affix items without worrying about what else you get, just do Blood Maiden with Profane Mind Cage on repeat in the Helltides, and make sure that you contribute at least 1 heart to the spawn so that you get the actual bonus rewards. If you want to do it more passively, you can just get higher chances still from Nightmare dungeons and pit runs too, just far less efficiently so. Then Torment ladder bosses again do have higher drop rates on them as well, at least as far as we can tell, and this is especially important to note because these bosses also have their own tables of uniques that they are likely to drop, and if your build has a specific unique that it is particularly important to it, you may well benefit quite a lot from having it with Greater Affixes, and there's simply no better way to hunt a specific unique with Greater Affixes than by fighting the Torment version of the ladder boss that specifically drops it. With that covered then, let's talk about tempering. Obviously this doesn't apply to the uniques that I was just talking about, but it does apply to the more common Greater Affix items, which are legendaries. The first thing is that you need to be hyper aware of what makes your own build work as an individual, because this will change from person to person. As an example, Bash Barbarian build. The single most important affix on the entire build is cleave damage with Bash, which is a tempering affix, as this is a multiplier to the skill's damage. I don't just mean this is the strongest tempering affix, I mean it's the strongest affix as a whole. There's of course a second tempering slot, the offensive slot for weapons, and we ideally want that to be damage against close enemies, but knowing which one of these is a priority and by how much is very important, because it means in this scenario, I will focus on Bash Cleave above all else with my weapons. With luck, you will eventually reroll to the affix that you want. This is the next stage of decision making for tempering, because if you get the right stat but a bad roll within the range, you have to consider how valuable the item item is as a whole, and how important the stat is if you want to reroll it. Again, bringing it back to the Barbarian Bash build, this is the singular most important stat on the build that you could possibly have. So it is worth taking a chance at potentially bricking an otherwise solid Greater Affix item to hunt a better roll on Bash Cleave, even if I did get a lower roll on the right affix, because the item would simply be worse than a worse weapon with the better roll on that affix. That said, that's definitely an outlier. There are builds with tempers that are that important that you really do need to be aware of it if they exist in your build, but outside of those niche scenarios, I would almost never re-roll a temper that is the correct affix if it's on an item with multiple good Greater Affixes on it to begin with. For the most part, having the right temper affix is more important than having the right roll, especially if the item that you are tempering onto is good enough that bricking it would be a genuine disappointment. And a beautiful part of this is that it means that you might leave an item with temper rerolls remaining and just sort of go with it. But that means that next time that you find a potential upgrade for that slot, you can just use the rerolls that were remaining on your current item and see how nuts you can make it before deciding whether you want to replace it or not with the new one. And honestly, that's most of what it comes down to. You need to understand the context of your build and how important each tempered affix is. If it is the most important affix on the whole item, then it is worth focusing even above the Greater Affixes. If it is just generally strong to have, then it is one that you want to roll onto the item first, but at least to begin with, only reroll until you get the correct affix, even if it's just a middling or low roll of it. Then get your second affix on it from tempering and get it to the right affix as well. If you have rerolls remaining at the end of that, then you can decide how risky you want to be after that, how much the item is really worth to you. As well, it's worth mentioning there are some slots for some builds that just have a sort of completely unnecessary temper slot, basically, like the affix choices don't actually help your power level, and in those cases, just put all of the resources there into the main temper, all the rerolls into the one that does actually matter to make sure it is perfect. As simple as that. Outside of that, there are tons of rumors going on that are pretty unsubstantiated around tempering so far, I would say. I would be remiss not to mention the fact that this is a thing, because I've heard them going around, but there is no evidence as of this immediate moment to support the idea that there are ways to game the system when it comes to what you roll when tempering an item. And that's across the board. And none of these rumors that I've seen have anything actually behind them. They're just sort of the things that people are coming up with to try and make it feel better, and it just doesn't actually make any sense. That just about does it for today then. Just a sort of roundup of the best ways that both I and the community have found to actively sort of farm Greater Affix gear, as it is definitely the proper end state of any piece of equipment. As in a perfect world, we would be wearing a full set of gear that is completely filled with Greater Affixes, and in the world that you did, you would essentially just be about 50% stronger, at minimum, than a player that had no Greater Affix gear at all. And that's nuts to think about the difference that it could give you. As well, we of course covered tempering and specifically how to avoid bricking an item, because in my mind, the best tempering practices are very different for an item with multiple useful Greater Affixes than it is for a run-of-the-mill item you can replace in just a few minutes, because the item is difficult to get a hold of to begin with, and you want to minimize the chances of bricking it while still customizing it to be the item that will boost your power in a proper way. Hopefully, some of these tips or concepts will help you out in perfecting your own build as the season continues. I know a few of the ideas may seem a bit obvious to more experienced ARPG players, but it's just a set of easy guidelines that anyone can follow to take massive advantage of one of the strongest new systems in the game. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.